15 disgusting dishes served at royal feasts. When we imagine royal banquets, we picture opulence, golden goblets, towering platters of roasted meat, glittering halls echoing with music and laughter. But beneath the surface of this grandeur lay a world of culinary horrors. Dishes so bizarre, revolting, or downright inedible by modern standards that they would send today's food critics running. For the kings, queens, and nobles of medieval and Renaissance Europe, food was more than sustenance. It was power, spectacle, and performance. Every banquet was a chance to flaunt wealth, intimidate rivals, and dazzle foreign guests. And the more exotic, rare, or outrageous the dish, the more impressive the host seemed. Flavor came second to presentation. Decadence often meant excess for its own sake. From gelatinous sea monsters to blood-curdling stews, the menus of history's elite reveal a stomach-churning side to royal life that most would rather forget. Here are 15 of the most disgusting dishes ever served at royal feasts, and why you'd be lucky to survive one bite. Number 1. Lamprey pie, the slimy delicacy of kings. To modern eyes, it looks like a monster, an eel-like creature with no jaws, just a gaping circular mouth lined with rasping teeth. But to medieval and Renaissance royalty, the lamprey wasn't a nightmare. It was a delicacy worth its weight in silver. Lampreys were a status symbol, reserved for kings, queens, and the wealthiest lords. Their rarity made them exclusive. Their taste, at least to elite palates of the time, was said to be rich and savory, especially when drowned in spices and sauces to mask their natural sliminess. These creatures were poached from rivers like the Severn in England and kept in stone tanks to fatten before slaughter. One of the most notorious preparations was lamprey pie. The process began with boiling the lampreys alive to soften the flesh, already an unpleasant start. Then came the blood. Cooks would slit open the fish and collect their blood into a bowl. This wasn't discarded. It was mixed with red wine, vinegar, pepper, cloves, and cinnamon to make the pie's rich sauce. A whole pie crust would be lined with chunks of the lamprey, bones, teeth, and all, before being drenched in this spiced blood gravy and sealed with pastry. The pie was then baked, sometimes for hours, until it emerged thick, dark, and pungent. To guests unaccustomed to the taste, the texture was a shock. Lamprey flesh is fatty, gelatinous, and distinctly fishy. The spiced blood only amplified the intensity. Yet, to the royal courts of England and France, this was the height of sophistication. King Henry I of England is famously said to have died from a surfeit of lampreys, possibly a euphemism for food poisoning or gout after overindulging. The dish wasn't just about flavor, it was about power. To serve lamprey pie was to show dominance over nature, wealth in the kitchen, and allegiance to tradition. Royal chefs often used elaborate pastry decorations, coats of arms, animal figures, or crowns to top the pies, turning each grotesque meal into a work of edible propaganda. Today, lamprey pie is almost forgotten, except in a few corners of Britain where ancient tradition still clings on. But in its heyday, it was a shining and slimy symbol of royal excess and one of the most revolting dishes ever served beneath a golden chandelier. Number 2. Cockatrice, a frankenfeast of flesh and folly. If medieval chefs had access to sewing needles and twisted imaginations, the cockatrice was their crowning horror. This monstrous creation was exactly what it sounds like, half pig, half bird, stitched together like something from a royal butcher's nightmare. To create a cockatrice, you started with a whole piglet and a whole large bird, usually a capon, goose, or peacock. Then came the butchery. The cook would slice both animals in half at the torso. The front half of the piglet was then stitched to the rear half of the bird, or vice versa, depending on which direction the host wanted the creature to face. Legs, wings, tails, they were reshaped, repositioned, or discarded entirely to make the whole thing look vaguely plausible. Sometimes the hybrid was made to stand proudly upright, other times crouched in a pouncing pose, jaws bared, wings stretched. But the true horror wasn't the craftsmanship, it was the purpose. The cockatrice wasn't meant to be delicious, it was spectacle food. Royalty and nobles didn't just want to eat, they wanted to shock. This sewn-together beast would be basted in saffron and wine, roasted slowly until golden, and presented at the center of the banquet as guests gasped in theatrical horror. In some versions, it was glazed with gold leaf or painted with edible dyes. In others, the creature was filled with spiced forcemeat or live birds that would explode out when sliced open. There was no seasoning to save it. The combination of greasy pork and gamey bird meat produced a clash of textures and smells. The pork often overcooked while the poultry dried out. Chewing through meat stitched with twine or sinew wasn't just unappetizing, it was a challenge. Guests often pushed it around their trenchers more than they ate it. But that didn't matter. The point was that your court had the wealth, the game animals, and the nerve to create such a thing. Cockatrice symbolized dominance over nature, an edible monstrosity meant to awe and unsettle. It blurred the line between feast and farce, horror and humor. For the medieval elite, that line didn't matter. In a world where power was flaunted through food, the cockatrice stood as a grotesque reminder that excess, not taste, ruled the royal table. Number 3. Boar's head with mustard sauce. The boar's head was a staple of grand feasts, a dramatic centerpiece symbolizing hunting prowess and royal strength. Often presented snarling with teeth and tusks intact, and sometimes with fur singed but still smoldering, the boar's head was more a visual performance than a simple dish. After a long hunt, the boar's head would be cleaned, boiled to tenderize the tough meat, then roasted until the skin was crisp. It was served with a thick mustard sauce, sharp, pungent, and spicy enough to cut through the rich, gamey meat. The head might be garnished with herbs, fruits, or flowers to enhance the display. Eating the boar's head was a visceral experience. The tough, oily meat clung to the bones, requiring skill and effort to carve. The flavor was earthy and wild, often fatty, with a strong, musky aroma that reminded diners of the forest. Symbolically, the boar represented ferocity and valor, prized traits in medieval nobility. Serving the boar's head showed mastery over nature and the spoils of the hunt, reinforcing status and power. While modern diners might find the spectacle intimidating and the meat challenging, in its time the boar's head was a crowning glory of feasts, bold, primal, and unforgettable. Number 4. Black pudding. Black pudding, a blood sausage, was a common yet divisive dish at royal feasts, symbolizing medieval nobility's resourcefulness in leaving nothing to waste. This iron-rich sausage was made by mixing pig's blood with fat, oats or barley, and a blend of spices, then stuffing the mixture into cleaned pig intestines and boiling or frying it to a dense, dark loaf. The appearance of black pudding was immediately off-putting to many guests, a deep, almost black cylinder with a slightly rough texture. When sliced, its interior revealed a coarse, crumbly mass that emitted a metallic scent, owing to the high iron content from the blood. The taste was equally bold and challenging, heavy, earthy, and iron-rich, with a texture that was simultaneously crumbly and greasy. In royal courts, black pudding was often served as part of a larger meat platter, accompanied by bread and sharp sauces designed to cut through its richness. The dish was praised for its hearty sustenance, providing a substantial dose of protein and iron, but it was certainly an acquired taste. It could be greasy and dense to the point of feeling like a sludge sliding down the throat. Historically, black pudding was a practical way to use every part of the slaughtered animal, ensuring that nothing went to waste. This made it both a peasant staple and a noble curiosity, with royal cooks elevating it by adding expensive spices such as cloves, nutmeg, and pepper. However, hygiene standards were rudimentary at best, and improperly prepared black pudding could harbor unpleasant tastes or even cause illness. Despite its humble origins, the inclusion of black pudding on a royal menu demonstrated a sort of culinary bravado, a willingness to embrace dishes that were powerful, nutritious, and unmistakably visceral. For nobles, eating black pudding was a reminder of their connection to the land, livestock, and the cycle of life and death that sustained their wealth. Though many modern palates shy away from blood-based foods, black pudding remains a culinary link to the past, a dish that embodied medieval attitudes toward food, survival, and status. Number 5. Stuffed udders. One of the most stomach-turning dishes served in medieval royal courts was stuffed cow's udders. This unusual delicacy embodied the era's penchant for nose-to-tail cooking and extravagance, transforming an offal cut into a regal feast centerpiece. The udders were first thoroughly cleaned and boiled to soften their naturally rubbery and spongy texture. Then they were carefully stuffed with a rich mixture of minced offal, usually liver, kidneys, or other organ meats, combined with breadcrumbs, herbs, and spices. The stuffed udders were simmered or baked in a thick wine-based sauce that added depth and complexity. The resulting dish was a study in contrasts. The udder's chewy, slightly rubbery exterior encased a dense, savory filling bursting with iron-rich organ meat flavors. The thick wine sauce, often heavily spiced with cinnamon, cloves, and pepper, cut through the richness and added a subtle sweetness. Despite the careful preparation, many diners struggled with the texture and the psychological challenge of eating such an intimate part of the cow. Historically, serving stuffed udders was a way for nobles to showcase both their wealth and their culinary daring. It was a dish that said, "We waste nothing here, and our palate is fearless." The presence of offal on royal tables also demonstrated that no part of the animal was beneath the king or queen, reinforcing the idea of dominion over nature. The preparation was labor-intensive, requiring skillful cleaning and careful cooking to ensure the dish was both edible and presentable. Still, the rubbery chew and intense organ flavors meant that stuffed udders were often more admired for their novelty and status symbolism than for their universal appeal. For medieval diners, stuffed udders were part ritual, part gastronomic adventure, an extravagant expression of feasting culture that pushed the boundaries of what was considered edible and acceptable. Number 6. Swan roasted in its own skin. Roasted swan was a royal delicacy, reserved for only the most prestigious banquets, where the goal was to awe guests with rarity and spectacle. But the presentation of swan roasted in its own skin was something out of a medieval nightmare, combining elaborate cooking techniques with a flair for dramatic display. The bird was carefully killed and plucked, but then redressed in its feathers before roasting, a process requiring great skill and patience. The feathers were carefully reattached or arranged to cover the skin, which would crisp under the heat. This gave the effect of a living swan, whole and majestic, but slowly roasting over the fire. The dish was often served flaming, with attendants lighting the feathers briefly at the table, sending plumes of smoke and sparks into the air. The meat inside was lean and muscular, with a strong, gamey flavor typical of wildfowl. The texture was firm, but sometimes tough, reflecting the swan's aquatic lifestyle and diet. For medieval guests, eating swan was both a culinary honor and a challenge, as the meat required careful carving and patience. The spectacle of a flaming swan on the table was as much a message as a meal, an assertion of the host's wealth, daring, and command over the natural world. In an age when exotic animals were tokens of prestige, serving swan in this manner demonstrated absolute mastery. Despite the visual drama, many diners preferred to admire the spectacle rather than consume the flesh. The roasted swan, especially refeathered and flaming, embodied the extremes of medieval courtly dining: beautiful, bizarre, and borderline grotesque. Number 7. Piglet in blanket of its own intestines. The piglet in a blanket of medieval times was nothing like the cozy sausage rolls we think of today. Instead, it was a whole, suckling piglet, meticulously wrapped in its own cleaned and prepared intestines, then roasted over an open flame or in an oven until the skin was crisp and the innards melded into a rich, savory package. The process began with skilled butchers and cooks painstakingly removing and cleaning the intestines, which were then soaked, salted, and softened. The tiny piglet, often still with fine downy hair, was stuffed with herbs, spices, and sometimes additional offal, then swaddled in the pliable intestines like a grotesque culinary burrito. The dish was basted frequently with fat or wine, creating a crispy outer casing that contrasted with the tender, juicy meat inside. To medieval nobles, the piglet wrapped in its own entrails was the ultimate show of extravagance and mastery over butchery. The dish was prized for its layered flavors: the sweetness of the young meat, the pungent richness of the intestines, and the aromatic spices all melding together. Yet the visual was often unsettling to outsiders, a whole piglet ensconced in what looked like a grisly membrane, reminding diners of the thin line between life and death. Eating the piglet in blanket was an exercise in both indulgence and bravado. Guests had to wrestle with the strange texture of the intestines, which could be chewy and slightly bitter, while enjoying the tenderness of the roast pig inside. The dish was often served during major feasts and celebrations, a reminder that royal tables could embrace the grotesque for the sake of novelty and status. Number 8. Fish in jelly. Aspic. Aspic, a gelatinous, savory jelly, might sound elegant today, but medieval fish aspics were often unappetizing showpieces that blended odd textures with flavors few modern diners would tolerate. The fish was cooked, deboned, and set into a thick jelly made by boiling fish stock with animal gelatin or crushed bones, sometimes flavored with vinegar or wine. The resulting dish was served cold, often molded into elaborate shapes or centerpieces on the banquet table. The jelly was translucent but wobbly, a shimmering mass that trapped fish chunks inside like some macabre aquarium. Its texture was slimy and slippery, making it difficult to eat without the pieces sliding off the plate. Medieval cooks considered aspic a mark of culinary sophistication, a way to preserve and present food artistically. But to the average diner, the cold, gelatinous texture clashed sharply with the fish's flaky flesh, and the strong vinegary or spice notes could overwhelm the palate. Fish aspics were often served on fast days when meat was forbidden, so cooks had to get creative with seafood. Despite its regal presentation, the dish's odd mouthfeel and the visual of suspended fish parts made it a feast curiosity rather than a favorite. Number 9. Calf's foot jelly. a cousin to fish aspic, calf's foot jelly was a cold, bony dessert made by boiling calves' hooves and feet for hours until the collagen and marrow dissolved into a thick gelatin. The strained broth was poured into molds and allowed to set, forming a dense, chewy jelly with a pale, almost translucent appearance. Although called a dessert, calf's foot jelly was often flavored with wine, honey, or spices rather than sugar, giving it a savory sweet complexity. The idea was to create a nourishing, palate-cleansing dish to follow heavy meat courses. Eating calf's foot jelly was an unusual experience. The jelly was cold and gelatinous, but with an undeniable bone broth flavor, earthy, rich, and slightly metallic. Its texture was rubbery yet fragile, making it slippery on the tongue. Like other gelatin dishes, it showcased medieval cooks' skill in transforming humble parts of the animal into elegant fare. However, many guests found the idea of eating foot-derived jelly unsettling, especially given the visible tiny bone fragments sometimes caught in the gelatin. Number 10. Roasted peacock. Peacock was considered the pinnacle of exotic poultry in medieval Europe, gracing the tables of kings and queens during the most lavish feasts. The preparation was as theatrical as the bird itself. After roasting the peacock to tender perfection, chefs would painstakingly reattach its iridescent feathers and sometimes dye them, presenting the bird alive in appearance but cooked to perfection. The roasted peacock was often set aflame at the table, creating a spectacular display of fire and smoke that dazzled guests. The meat was firm and mildly gamey, similar to turkey but richer, prized for its rarity and the prestige it conferred on the host. Despite its glamour, peacock was not universally enjoyed. The firm, sometimes dry flesh required skillful cooking, and the dramatic feather presentation combined with the fiery theatrics made it more a spectacle than a straightforward meal. Roasted peacock embodied medieval nobility's obsession with visual grandeur and exotic rarity, making it less about flavor and more about awe and status. Number 11. Porpoise with vinegar sauce. Porpoise meat was a curious royal fast-day substitute for forbidden red meat in medieval Europe. Since porpoises were considered fish under ecclesiastical law, they could be eaten on days when meat was banned, such as Lent or other religious fasts. This loophole made porpoise a prized, if unusual, delicacy on royal menus. The preparation involved butchering the large sea mammal, which was no easy feat. The tough, oily flesh had a strong, distinctive flavor, somewhere between fish and whale, that was unfamiliar to most diners. Porpoise meat was typically boiled or roasted and served with a sharp vinegar-based sauce to cut through the richness and mask any overpowering oceanic taste. The vinegar sauce was made by simmering wine vinegar with herbs, spices, and sometimes honey, creating a pungent, tangy glaze. The sharpness of the sauce complemented the fatty texture of the porpoise meat, making it more palatable for the guests. Eating porpoise was often a test of one's sophistication and tolerance for odd flavors. The dense, oily texture could be off-putting, and the pungent, fishy smell lingered long after the meal. Still, in the strict rules of medieval fasting, porpoise was a way for nobles to enjoy a large, impressive feast, while technically abiding by religious restrictions. The dish was a symbol of both the era's complex relationship with food and faith, and the nobility's desire to flaunt their ability to obtain exotic and unusual ingredients even under strict dietary rules. Beaver tail was another fish loophole exploited by medieval chefs to circumvent meat prohibitions during fasts. According to canon law, beavers were classified as semi-aquatic creatures and thus could be eaten on fast days, making their tails a valuable delicacy in noble kitchens. The tail, coated in dense, oily fur and covered with rough scales underneath, was usually skinned, cleaned, and roasted over an open fire or spit. The meat was fatty and somewhat gelatinous, with a rich, gamey flavor, distinct from typical fish or terrestrial animals. Medieval feasts often featured beaver tail served simply, roasted until blistered and dripping fat. Some preparations involved glazing the meat with honey or herbs to balance its strong taste. For diners, the idea of eating a rodent's tail was unusual, but its taste and texture earned a reputation as a delicacy that could rival more common game meats. The symbolic status of beaver tail was also notable. Its designation as fish was a creative loophole that allowed nobles to enjoy luxurious meals without violating fasting rules, reflecting the inventiveness of medieval culinary tradition and religious interpretation. Milksop was a dish that combined humble ingredients in a way that only medieval nobles could appreciate. At its simplest, it consisted of stale bread soaked in hot milk, then drizzled with beef fat or butter. This might sound like a simple comfort food, but in noble households, it was elevated with the addition of spices such as cinnamon, ginger, and saffron, as well as sometimes sweetened with honey. The texture of milksop was soggy, mushy, and almost porridge-like, often described as a warm, sloppy bowl of bread pudding. The contrast between the mild creaminess of the milk and the savory richness of melted beef fat created a strangely addictive flavor, though it was definitely not for the faint-hearted. This dish was served both as a hearty breakfast for the nobility and as a way to use up stale bread in a manner more palatable than simple hard loaves. It reflected medieval cooks' pragmatism and their skill in turning the simplest ingredients into something luxurious by adding expensive spices. For modern palates, milksop might seem bland or unappetizing, but for medieval aristocrats, it was a comfort food that combined warmth, fat, and spice, three elements central to their idea of nourishment and indulgence. Number 14, head cheese. Head cheese, or brawn, was a meat jelly made by boiling the head and feet of a pig until the collagen-rich parts dissolved and thickened the broth naturally into gelatin. The meat from the head, cheeks, and sometimes tongue was shredded and mixed into this thick jelly, which was then poured into molds and allowed to set. The resulting loaf was served cold and sliced, often accompanied by vinegar or spicy mustard to cut through its richness. The texture was firm yet yielding, with a cold, gelatinous bite that could be off-putting to unaccustomed diners. Head cheese was prized for its ability to use parts of the animal that otherwise might be discarded, turning offal into a respectable, if humble, delicacy. It was a staple on noble tables where nothing was wasted, and showcasing such dishes was a mark of culinary sophistication. Despite its utilitarian roots, head cheese could be spiced and garnished lavishly, making it visually appealing. However, the very idea of eating cheese made from a pig's head could cause hesitation, especially among guests unused to eating offal. Number 15, rook pie. Rook pie was a curious dish that capitalized on the medieval affinity for game birds, even those considered pests. Rooks, members of the crow family, were small black birds often found in large numbers around the countryside. Their beaks, claws, and feathers were removed, but the meat itself was cooked inside a thick, hearty pie crust. The flavor of rook was gamey and somewhat bitter, reflecting the bird's diet of insects and seeds. The meat was tough and required slow cooking with fat, onions, and herbs to soften. The pie often included all parts of the bird, making for a somewhat coarse and rustic eating experience. To medieval diners, rook pie was an acquired taste, something eaten out of necessity or for the novelty. Its inclusion on royal menus was a sign of either extravagance or an attempt to impress with exotic fare, even if the bird itself was considered a pest in rural areas. The pie's crust helped mask the strong flavors and provided a comforting carbohydrate base, but biting into pieces of rook could still challenge even the most adventurous eaters.